Every passenger in first class froze as Harrison Vance leaned over a teenage black girl's seat, his words striking like a slap. "Sweetheart, you're in the wrong place. This isn't your seat." He didn't ask. He declared it, with the confidence of a man who had never once been told no. Zendaya didn't flinch. Without even lifting her eyes from her notes, she slid her boarding pass onto the tray table in front of him. Two letters stared back at him. 2D. Her name was printed in bold. Her proof was undeniable. But here came his second blow. Harrison didn't even glance at the ticket. He smirked, waved it away, and said, "I don't care what's on that paper. You don't belong here." That's when the cabin froze. A teenage black girl with a valid first-class ticket, being told her seat didn't matter. An executive, dripping with power, insisting the rules didn't apply to him. And a crowd of silent passengers, watching a battle of presence, privilege, and perception unfold at 30,000 feet. So let me ask you, in that moment, if it were you sitting in Zendaya's place, would you move or would you fight? Before we get into the full story, pause for just a moment, because what you're about to witness isn't just a seat dispute. It's a battle over respect, power, and who truly belongs. If you believe stories like this need to be told, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe. Your support helps bring these hidden struggles to light. And trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Zendaya Carter wasn't supposed to stand out. At least not here, not on this flight. She looked like any other teenager, headphones around her neck, sneakers tucked neatly beneath the wide leather seat of Orajet's polished first-class cabin. But she wasn't like everyone else. Her notes glowed faintly on the tablet in her lap. Equations and diagrams that looked like pure chaos to the untrained eye, but held the seed of a world-changing invention. A clean energy breakthrough that could shift the balance of global power. Her mother insisted she fly first class. "You deserve to be comfortable before the biggest presentation of your life," she had said. Zendaya thought it was just a splurge, an indulgence for a nervous 16-year-old on the way to the National STEM Challenge. What she didn't know was that her mother wasn't spending money she didn't have. She was protecting what was already hers. At that very same moment, in another corner of the terminal, Harrison Vance was seething. His flight had been delayed, his schedule thrown off, and now he was stomping down the jetway like the world owed him an apology. A tall, sharply dressed executive with cufflinks that probably cost more than some passengers' monthly rent. He wasn't traveling to be inspired. He was traveling to destroy. His company thrived on crushing competition, and a youth STEM challenge was just another hunting ground. The seat printed on his boarding pass was 3C. But Harrison didn't believe in rows and numbers. He believed in entitlement. For years, he had sat in 2D on Orajet flights, a small but symbolic claim to dominance. That seat belonged to him, or so he thought. When he boarded and saw Zendaya sitting in his spot, he stopped dead. His jaw tightened. His hand lingered on the seat back like a king arriving at a throne already occupied. Passengers looked up from their champagne glasses, their eyes darting between the suited man blocking the aisle and the quiet black teenager flipping through scientific notes. The tension was invisible but sharp. A moment that should have been mundane, just a man finding his place, was turning into something else. Something dangerous. Harrison didn't move on. He didn't even check his ticket. He just stood there, staring, lips curling into the faintest sneer. Zendaya looked up, her eyes calm, almost puzzled, like she couldn't quite believe someone was staring at her seat with that much hostility. She tilted her head, just slightly, before lowering her eyes back to her notes. The silence in the cabin was loud. You could hear the soft chime of a phone unlocking, the clink of ice against glass. Nobody wanted to be the first to speak. But Harrison did. That's where the storm began. And the next words out of his mouth would set the entire cabin on fire. Harrison didn't pause. He didn't check the row, the seat number, or even his own boarding pass. He simply planted himself in the aisle, towering over Zendaya like the space around her was already his. His words dripped with arrogance, delivered loud enough for the nearby passengers to hear. "I think you're in the wrong seat, sweetheart. This is 2D. His hand flicked carelessly toward the back of the plane, as if her place in the world was already settled back there, far from first class. Zendaya looked up slowly, calm but unshaken. She didn't argue. She didn't plead. She simply placed her boarding pass on the tray table between them. C2D. Her name, clear as daylight. Her proof was right there, undeniable. But Harrison didn't even glance at it. He gave a short, dismissive laugh. Cute, but let's not play games. That seat doesn't belong to you. His voice was smooth, but underneath, it carried something colder. A certainty that his status alone outweighed her truth. For a moment, the air in the cabin thickened. Passengers shifted in their seats, pretending not to watch, but they were listening. Everyone could feel the tension blooming. This wasn't a mistake. This was something else. Zendaya's eyes didn't flinch. She tucked her ticket back in her notebook, lifted her chin, and replied with quiet certainty, "My seat is valid. I'm not moving." That single sentence was enough to pierce his pride. To Harrison, it wasn't just about a seat anymore. It was about control, about making sure a teenage black girl didn't challenge him in a space he thought was reserved for people like him. He leaned closer, lowering his voice but sharpening the edge. "Listen carefully. You don't want to make this complicated." His words carried a threat dressed up as advice. And that was the moment the conflict stopped being about numbers on a boarding pass. It became something much uglier, his entitlement against her right to exist where she belonged. But just as Harrison's sneer deepened, a shadow appeared at the edge of the row, a flight attendant, stepping forward, ready to resolve the situation. The aisle was still tense when a figure in navy blue stepped forward. Brenda, the senior flight attendant, moved with the calm authority of someone who had worked 1,000 flights. To the untrained eye, she looked like the solution walking in. But the look on her face told another story. She greeted Harrison first, flashing him a reassuring smile, the kind reserved for platinum members and powerful men. Then her eyes cut to Zendaya. Cold, sharp, suspicious. The shift in tone was instant and unmistakable. "Miss, may I see your ticket?" Her voice carried the weight of discretion, but there was no such request for Harrison. He stood beside her, arms folded, watching with smug satisfaction as Brenda scrutinized Zendaya's presence like a stain on first class. Zendaya handed over her boarding pass without hesitation. Brenda held it up to the light, studying it like it might reveal a trick. She even pressed her lips together as if she were catching someone in a lie. The irony? She never once glanced at Harrison's ticket. His word, his face, his status. That was all the verification she needed. This was no longer just Harrison versus Zendaya. This was the airline itself stepping into the ring. An institution cloaked in professionalism, but siding with entitlement. And for the passengers watching, it sent a clear message. The young black girl was the one on trial. Imagine the humiliation. Every eye in first class, pretending not to stare, while the person sworn to protect order treated you like a criminal. No loud words, no insults, just a quiet erosion of dignity in front of strangers. Zendaya's ticket was valid. Brenda knew it, but still she lingered, scanning it twice, searching for a loophole. Harrison smirked, already tasting victory. And then Brenda leaned down, her voice low but cutting. "We'll get this sorted out, but until then, I'll need you to stand." The cabin went silent. Harrison's grin widened, and Zendaya, still seated, tightened her grip on her notebook. She wasn't moving. Not yet. Harrison's smile never reached his eyes. It was the kind of smile men like him wore before they started dismantling you piece by piece, politely, strategically, and without ever raising their voice. "Well," he said, leaning just close enough for only Zendaya and the nearby passengers to hear, "I suppose mistakes happen. Maybe you're confused about the cabin layout." The words were light, even gentle, but underneath them was a blade. He wasn't questioning her ticket anymore. He was questioning her place. Zendaya didn't blink. Her boarding pass was still tucked neatly in her notebook, her posture still composed. But the message was clear. He wasn't backing down. He was doubling down. Harrison turned to Brenda, the flight attendant still standing nearby, and dropped his first real threat. "You know, I've been a platinum titanium member with Orajet for 12 years, he said casually. I spend more on flights in a quarter than most people make in a year. I'd hate for this situation to reflect poorly on the crew. It was subtle, but everyone understood what he was really saying. Fix this, or your job might disappear. Brenda shifted uneasily, caught between corporate loyalty and blatant bias. We're just trying to resolve a seating error, sir, she said, her tone softer now, deferential, even. Harrison's confidence swelled. He was in familiar territory now. The language of power, of influence, of being untouchable. Of course, he replied smoothly, but I'm sure Orajet values the experience of its most seasoned travelers. It's not just about policy, it's about discretion. It's about keeping the right kind of passengers comfortable. The words hung heavy in the air. The right kind of passengers. Not young, not black, not brilliant, not Zendaya. For the first time, a few passengers began to murmur. They weren't siding with Harrison, but they weren't stepping in either. They were watching a masterclass in modern racism, one that didn't scream or spit or shout, one that smiled while it stripped a person's dignity bare. Zendaya sat silently, but inside her chest, a fire burned hotter with every condescending syllable. She had seen this before. The way people like Harrison cloaked prejudice in professionalism, the way their insults were disguised as advice. And still, he kept going. Maybe this is just a misunderstanding, he continued, his voice now syrupy sweet. Maybe someone made a mistake entering the ticketing information. Happens all the time. Or maybe your standby upgrade. It's nothing to be ashamed of. Each word was a needle. Each sentence, a reminder that in his mind, she could not possibly belong. Have you ever felt that before? Talked down to like a child, even when you knew you were right? It's a quiet kind of violence, the kind that doesn't make headlines, but leaves scars all the same. Zendaya's grip tightened around the edge of her notebook. She wasn't going to cry. She wasn't going to move. And she wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of watching her shrink. But Harrison wasn't finished. Here's what's going to happen, he said finally, straightening his tie. You're going to step aside so we can sort this out properly. It's for everyone's safety and operational necessity. Operational necessity. That corporate shield people like him always hid behind. The phrase was designed to end arguments, and end people like her. Brenda looked at Zendaya expectantly, as if those words alone carried the weight of law. But Zendaya didn't budge. She didn't even look up. And just when Harrison opened his mouth to press harder, the flight attendant's radio crackled to life with a message from the front of the plane. A message that would change everything. Zendaya Carter sat still, her hands folded neatly over her notes, her face calm but unreadable. The storm around her had already escalated beyond logic, beyond reason. A grown man twice her age had tried to strip her seat away, and now the flight attendant stood over her, uniform pressed and posture rigid, as if she were preparing to enforce a law. But Zendaya's voice didn't shake. It didn't rise. It didn't plead. My ticket is valid, she said softly, and I'm not moving. The entire first-class cabin seemed to inhale at once. A 16-year-old black girl, alone among strangers, refusing to yield even as the pressure closed in from every side. Harrison Vance leaned back in his seat, lips curling into a smug half-smile. He thought he had one already. To him, Zendaya's calmness wasn't strength, it was weakness. And weakness was his playground. The flight attendant's eyes narrowed. Her voice dropped into that cold, practiced tone that flight crews use when they want to remind passengers who really controls the cabin. If you refuse to cooperate, she said, pausing just long enough to make the silence sting, we will have to deplane and have you removed by airport security. There it was, the ultimate threat. Not just humiliation, not just losing a seat. This was now about police, about records, about force. And the cruelest irony? Zendaya had done nothing wrong. She was in the seat her mother had paid for, the seat her ticket confirmed. But the truth didn't matter here. What mattered was perception. The weight of authority pressing down on the one person in the cabin was conditioned to doubt. The passengers shifted in their plush leather seats. Some glanced away, pretending not to see. Others stole quick, guilty looks at Zendaya, as though waiting for her to break. And then there were those few, the ones glaring openly, their annoyance not at Harrison or the flight attendant, but at Zendaya herself for daring to hold her ground and threaten their schedule. This is how racism often works. It doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers through authority. Sometimes it hides inside policy, inside operational necessity, inside words that sound neutral but carry centuries of weight. Harrison's voice sliced into the silence, dripping with false concern. You don't want to make this worse for yourself, sweetheart. Trust me, these things can follow you. You'll miss your little competition, and maybe a lot more. Every word was a poisoned dart, aimed not just at her dignity, but at her future. Zendaya sat taller, even though her chest burned with fury. She thought of her mother's words, never, ever make yourself small for someone else's comfort. And yet, the reality was undeniable. She was 16. She was alone. And now she was being threatened with airport police. Passengers whispered. Brenda, the flight attendant, folded her arms with finality, ready to summon backup. Harrison's smirk widened, sensing victory was just one call away. But then Zendaya's hand moved. Slowly, deliberately. She reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and placed it on the tray table. The movement was so quiet, so steady, that it almost felt out of place amid the tension. To some, it looked like she was finally giving in, maybe calling her mother for help, maybe texting someone in panic. Harrison chuckled under his breath, already imagining her escorted down the aisle in shame. But Zendaya's eyes told a different story. Calm, focused, calculated. She unlocked her phone with a single tap. Her fingers moved once across the screen, then stopped. A single message sent. No hesitation. What she had just set in motion, no one in that cabin could have predicted. And as the flight attendant reached for her radio to summon airport police, Zendaya slid her phone face down on the table, her expression unreadable. It wasn't a call for help. It was a signal. And the person who received it was about to bring an entire empire down on this one flight. Zendaya Carter didn't move. Not when the threat of airport police hung in the air. Not when Harrison Vance's smirk widened like he'd already won. Not when Brenda, the flight attendant, folded her arms with the authority of someone certain her word was final. To the cabin, she looked like a teenage girl cornered into silence. But silence can be misleading. Zendaya's mother had drilled one lesson into her since childhood. Power isn't always about the noise you make. Sometimes it's about the storm you don't show. That was the storm sitting in 2D. Passengers watched her with a mixture of pity, annoyance, and impatience. A man across the aisle muttered under his breath about schedules. A woman in pearls rolled her eyes, as though Zendaya was the one inconveniencing everyone. The scene had become familiar. Authority pressing down on a black girl while the crowd chose comfort over conscience. Harrison, reclining smugly, mistook the stillness for surrender. He leaned toward her, voice coated with mock concern. Smart choice, sweetheart. Trust me, you don't want to push this any further. But Zendaya wasn't surrendering. She wasn't even hesitating, because the choice had already been made. The message already sent. And somewhere beyond this aircraft, someone with more power than Harrison or Brenda was already in motion. This is the part of racism people rarely talk about, how authority hides behind procedure. Brenda hadn't raised her voice, hadn't said anything openly cruel, but her threat of airport security carried centuries of history in its shadow. Harrison didn't need to shout. His smugness was backed by a system that too often believes men like him over girls like Zendaya. Yet here was Zendaya, sitting tall, refusing to shrink, her very presence an act of rebellion. She didn't argue anymore. She didn't need to. And that calm, unbothered expression on her face, it wasn't the face of defeat. It was the face of someone waiting for the clock to catch up with her decision. Have you ever seen someone so sure of their victory, only to realize the ground beneath them was already gone? That's where Harrison and Brenda were now. They just didn't know it yet. Because by the time the captain walked into that cabin, the balance of power would shift so violently that no one in 2B, or even 2C would ever forget it. The cabin thought Zendaya had gone silent. Harrison thought she was beaten. Brenda thought security was just one phone call away. But silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's strategy. Zendaya lifted her chin and finally spoke. Her voice wasn't raised, but it cut through the hum of the engines. Orajet's contract of carriage, Section 4B, states that a ticketed passenger with valid documentation cannot be removed from a paid seat without operational necessity. The words landed like a glass shattering on marble. Passengers who had been pretending not to watch turned their heads. Brenda blinked, thrown off balance. Harrison frowned, caught off guard. Zendaya didn't stop. She looked Brenda straight in the eye, calm as stone. Operational necessity covers emergencies, safety threats, and weight restrictions. None of those apply here. So if you call security, Orajet won't just be wrong. Orajet will be liable. And liable means lawsuits. Harrison tried to laugh it off, his voice dripping with mockery. Listen to her, quoting fine print like it's going to save her. But the laugh didn't land, because Zendaya wasn't just spitting words. She was dismantling the very weapon they were trying to use against her, policy. Brenda's confidence faltered. For the first time, she glanced around, realizing how many passengers were listening. Every second Zendaya spoke, the story shifted. The girl Harrison called sweetheart was no longer the problem. She was the precedent. If Orajet dragged her off this plane, every lawyer in America would have a field day. Zendaya leaned back, hands folded neatly in her lap, her notebook untouched. So if you want to escalate, go ahead. But you'll be escalating against your own rules. And the moment this goes public, Orajet's reputation will bleed faster than fuel in a ruptured tank. The silence that followed wasn't ordinary silence. It was heavy, charged. Harrison's smug grin was gone. Brenda's lips trembled as though she wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come. The balance of power had shifted. Not fully, not yet, but enough that the cabin could feel it. And then, with a sharp inhale, Brenda made her choice. She straightened her shoulders, voice clipped, and said the one line that pushed things into its next phase. The air in first class had turned heavy, like the cabin itself was holding its breath. Harrison finally sank into 2C with a huff, claiming the seat beside Zendaya as if it belonged to him by right. He smoothed his tie, stretched his legs, and then leaned back with that smug little half-smile, convinced he was still in control. Brenda, the senior flight attendant, stood frozen. She had just been dismantled by a 16-year-old quoting airline policy like a lawyer in court. And yet, she wasn't about to admit defeat. Not in front of passengers. Not in front of Harrison. So she reached for the last weapon in her arsenal. Authority. "I'll get the captain," she said. Her voice was sharp, clipped, try to sound confident. But if you listened closely, you could hear it, a tremor underneath, the sound of someone whose power was slipping. The cabin shifted. Passengers glanced at one another, whispering under their breath. Some nodded approvingly, eager to see order restored. Others looked uncomfortable, realizing this was no longer a simple seat mix-up. It was something uglier, something harder to ignore. And while all eyes followed Brenda, Zendaya sat completely still. Calm, silent, almost serene. To the average traveler, it might look like a child finally realizing she was in over her head. But the truth? She had already made her move. The text was sent. The signal was out. What came next was inevitable. That's the thing about discretion. It cuts both ways. Brenda thought calling the captain would seal Zendaya's fate. What she didn't know was that it would expose everything. But for now, the silence dragged on. The steady hum of the engines filled the space between heartbeats. Harrison straightened his tie, already imagining the captain's arrival, already picturing Zendaya being marched off the flight in humiliation. He believed in systems that had always worked in his favor. To him, the captain wasn't just an authority figure. He was a guarantee. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, in a glass-walled boardroom, Jasmine Carter's phone buzzed softly against the table. A single notification. She read it once. No reaction. No change in expression. Just a quiet tap of her fingers as she composed a reply. For years, she had built her empire in silence. But tonight, silence was about to roar. Back on Flight 762, Brenda disappeared behind the curtain toward the cockpit. The passengers leaned in. Harrison smirked. Zendaya adjusted her notebook on her lap, steady as ever. Most passengers thought the first-class standoff was just about a stubborn teenager and an entitled businessman. What they didn't know was that the balance of the entire flight had already shifted, silently, invisibly, with a single command. Jasmine Carter moved like a ghost in elite spaces. On paper, she was just another board member in Orijet's parent company. But paper lies. Behind layers of shell corporations and quiet trusts, she was the one holding the crown, the hidden owner of the airline. Her genius wasn't in being seen. It was in being underestimated. Men like Harrison thrived on being loud, but Jasmine had built an empire on silence. Silence that moved faster than words, faster than laws, faster than outrage. When her phone buzzed in that glass-walled boardroom, she didn't waste time. No panic, no drama, just two words. Two words that sliced through the chain of command like a knife through silk. Those two words didn't stay on her phone. They surged into the veins of Orijet itself, hitting the operations chief like a jolt of electricity. The man had spent his entire career terrified of losing Jasmine's trust. He didn't hesitate. Within 60 seconds, the cockpit of Flight 762 lit up with an alert rarely seen by even the most senior pilots. Alpha priority. The captain's eyes narrowed at the glowing message. This wasn't a suggestion. This wasn't a request. This was a command from a level of authority that overrode his own. It came with one meaning only. Whatever's happening in first class, the passenger in 2D is untouchable. Back in the cabin, Harrison reclined in smug anticipation, still believing the captain's arrival would be his victory. Brenda squared her shoulders, uniform pressed, convinced she was about to be validated. And Zendaya? She sat motionless, notebook resting on her lap, her expression calm. To the casual eye, she looked like a teenager waiting nervously for judgment. But the truth was simpler, sharper. She was waiting for inevitability to walk through the door. The passengers didn't know it yet, but the moment the cockpit door opened, Orijet's mask of discretion would fall away. And then came the sound, the soft, deliberate click of the lock releasing. The captain was about to step out, carrying a message that would flip the entire cabin upside down. The cabin doors stayed closed. The engines hummed, but the true noise came from the silence inside first class. You could feel the tension floating like static electricity, waiting for a spark. Every passenger's eyes were glued to the aisle as the captain himself stepped out of the cockpit. He wasn't just a man in uniform. He was the ultimate authority figure on this plane. His crisp jacket, the golden bars on his shoulders, the air of command that made people sit straighter when he passed. All of it carried weight. And Harrison Vance knew it. He leaned back in his seat, smug, already rehearsing the victory smile he'd flash when Zendaya was escorted away. The captain didn't rush. His steps were slow, deliberate. He paused just short of Zendaya's row, folding his hands behind his back as if to signal he had all the time in the world. The flight attendant, Brenda, wasted no time filling the silence. She leaned forward, her voice dripping with self-righteousness, delivering a neat little summary of the incident. "Captain, we have a passenger refusing to move from a premium seat. She's creating disruption in the cabin." Notice what she didn't say. She didn't mention Zendaya had the correct ticket. She didn't mention Harrison was demanding someone else's seat. She certainly didn't mention her own bias, the smile she reserved for him and the cold interrogation she gave Zendaya. No, Brenda spun the story the way she thought the captain wanted to hear it. Neat, simple, clean. A disobedient passenger. Problem solved with removal. Harrison cut in smoothly, playing his part. "Captain, I'm sure you can see this as a mistake. I fly this airline every week. That's my seat. She doesn't belong here." His voice was steady, his confidence absolute. He was the kind of man who believed the system existed to protect him. And why wouldn't he? It always had. The captain listened, expression stone-hard. His eyes flicked briefly to Zendaya, then back to Brenda and Harrison. And then, just as he opened his mouth to speak, something happened. A sharp ping from the flight-issued tablet clipped at his side. Every officer on an Orijet flight carried one. It was the airline's nervous system, policy updates, weather alerts, emergency codes. But this notification didn't look like the others. The captain glanced down. The words glowed red. Urgent. Alpha priority. That code was rare. So rare, most pilots only heard about it in training. He tapped the screen, and the message unfolded in a handful of lines. Passengers nearby couldn't see what it said, but they didn't need to. They saw his face. They saw the way his shoulders stiffened, the way the color drained from his skin, the way his lips parted as though he was reading something he couldn't believe. He looked up, not at Harrison, not at Brenda, but at Zendaya. And for the first time since stepping into that cabin, his posture changed. The rigid authority melted into something else, something you didn't see often from a captain of an international airline. Respect, deference, even a trace of fear. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice low, measured, careful. "My deepest apologies for this disturbance." The air cracked. Harrison's smirk vanished. Brenda's mouth fell open. Passengers exchanged stunned looks. What had just happened? Who was this teenage girl that the captain of the flight was apologizing to? The captain turned next, not to Zendaya, but to them. His voice sharpened, cutting like a blade. "You," he said to Brenda. "And you." His eyes locked on Harrison. "You have both created a serious incident involving a personal guest of this airline's owner." It was as if he had dropped a bomb right there in the aisle. Gasps rippled through the cabin. A personal guest of the airline's owner? Everyone knew Orajet's owner was a mystery, a shadowy figure never seen in public. And now the captain was telling them this quiet, black teenager, this girl they had tried to push out of her seat, was directly connected to that hidden power. Harrison sat frozen, unable to process. Brenda went pale, her confidence draining away faster than the blood from her face. The silence in the cabin wasn't silence anymore. It was shocked disbelief, the heavy weight of truth crashing down. And then, just as Harrison opened his mouth to protest, the captain raised a hand. Not another word. There are consequences you don't even begin to understand. The cabin held its breath. The storm wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun. What punishment was about to fall on Harrison and the flight attendant? And just how far would the hidden power of Zendaya's mother reach before this flight touched the ground? The air inside the first-class cabin shifted like someone had sucked all the oxygen out of it. Harrison Vance, a man who thrived on power plays, stood frozen, blinking in disbelief. A moment ago, he had been the unquestioned authority in the room, backed by a flight attendant eager to enforce his entitlement. Now, in the space of a single announcement from the captain, his world was collapsing. The personal guest of the airline's owner. The words rang out like a verdict. The passengers gasped, some hiding their shock behind champagne glasses, others leaning forward, hungry for the spectacle. The quiet teenager he had mocked and dismissed was suddenly revealed as untouchable. Royalty on this plane. Harrison's jaw worked, opening and closing, but no sound came out. His face flushed red, then drained pale. He tried to gather himself, but his body betrayed him. His hands shook as he clutched the armrest of 2D, the seat he believed belonged to him by right, not by ticket. He had wanted a show of dominance. He had gotten a public execution. The captain didn't waste a second. His tone was sharp, professional, stripped of warmth. "Mr. Vance, return to your assigned seat in 3C. Now, or I will have you removed from this aircraft before we push back." Passengers shifted, eyes darting between Harrison and Zendaya. You could almost feel the whispers crawling across the cabin. Did he just say the owner's guest? Wait, is this real? Brenda, the flight attendant who had sided with Harrison so confidently, stood frozen too. Her eyes widened, her lips parted, and the weight of her mistake began to show in her trembling hands. The captain's gaze cut through her like steel. "After we land, you will report directly to me for a full review of your conduct." He didn't have to say more. Everyone knew what full review meant. Harrison's arrogance, his swagger, his entitled smirk, it was all gone. He looked smaller now, as if the seat itself had shrunk under him. And the humiliation wasn't private. It was theater. Every passenger in first class watched as he slowly rose, every movement heavy, every step a lifetime. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the carpet as he shuffled past rows of wide eyes and hushed murmurs. The long walk back to 3C was no longer just a return to his rightful seat. It was a walk of shame, branded forever in the memory of everyone on that plane. Zendaya didn't flinch. She didn't smirk. She didn't celebrate. She sat still, spine straight, eyes steady on her notes. Her silence was its own weapon. She didn't need to prove herself anymore. The entire cabin had just witnessed who she was. Not just a girl with a ticket, but the heir to power Harrison couldn't begin to touch. And that silence, that refusal to gloat, cut deeper than any words. Harrison glanced back once, desperate for some acknowledgement, maybe even pity. Zendaya never lifted her eyes. He wasn't worth her time. Passengers whispered louder now, emboldened by the captain's declaration. A man in one, a lean to his wife. He tried to take her seat, and she's the owner's guest. The wife shook her head, disgusted. Typical. He thought his status would protect him. The ripple of recognition spread. In Harrison's world, status usually did protect him. But not today. Today, a black teenager in first class had stripped him of every ounce of borrowed authority. Brenda finally broke her silence. She whispered, barely audible, I didn't know. I didn't realize. But her words died under the weight of the cabin's judgment. The passengers didn't buy her sudden remorse. She hadn't known, but she hadn't cared either. She had treated Zendaya like she didn't belong, not because of confusion, but because of something much deeper. And now that bias had dragged her down into the same pit as Harrison. For Harrison, the consequences were only beginning. He dropped into 3C, trying to make himself invisible, but he couldn't escape the whispers, the stares, the invisible scarlet letter now stamped on his chest. He pulled out his phone, thumbs shaking, already typing frantic messages. Damage control. A desperate man trying to salvage his career before news of this humiliation spread beyond this cabin. But the truth was simple. The damage was already done. He had lost. And yet, if you thought Harrison would accept defeat quietly, you'd be wrong. The flicker of rage in his eyes as he typed revealed it. He wasn't just embarrassed. He was plotting. He wasn't just humiliated. He was angry. And that anger, if left unchecked, could be far more dangerous than his arrogance. Because Harrison Vance was not the kind of man to lick his wounds in silence. He was the kind of man who struck back. The cabin was no longer the same. Just a few minutes earlier, the space had been filled with whispers of doubt, eyes cutting at Zendaya like knives, and a flight attendant standing tall against her. But now, after the captain's sharp words and Harrison's humiliating walk of shame, everything felt inverted. The air was heavy, charged, as if the jet itself had tilted on its axis. And there she was, 16-year-old Zendaya Carter, sitting in 2D like nothing had happened. Not gloating, not smirking, just calm. She smoothed her notes, highlighted a line about energy storage, and leaned back ever so slightly. The quiet dignity in her posture said more than 1,000 words could. She didn't need to clap back. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her stillness was the loudest victory in the room. Passengers felt it. Some kept stealing glances at her, curiosity burning in their eyes. A few looked away quickly, embarrassed at how they had judged her minutes earlier. The same people who thought she was out of place were now watching her like she was untouchable. It was as if they had just learned there were unspoken rules to this cabin, rules they never imagined applied to a black teenager with a backpack and a ticket in her hand. Brenda, the flight attendant who had stood against her, was nowhere to be seen. She couldn't bring herself to pass through first class again, not after the captain's rebuke. Instead, other crew members shuffled in and out with stiff politeness, offering Zendaya drinks she didn't ask for, asking if she needed blankets or noise-canceling headphones. Their voices shook with something between guilt and fear. They weren't serving a passenger anymore. They were serving a reminder of who really held power here. And then there was Harrison Vance. Back in 3C, he was a shadow of himself. The same man who had walked onto the plane with chest puffed out, dripping entitlement, was now hunched low, scrolling furiously on his phone. His thumbs jabbed the screen as if he could text away the humiliation, text away the whispers, text away the truth that had been revealed in front of everyone. His jaw was tight, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrest. The humiliation was bad enough, but the real fear was sinking in, the corporate fallout. He wasn't stupid. He knew what it meant to insult the personal guest of the airline's owner. Contracts could vanish. Partnerships could collapse. Careers could end. Zendaya didn't look back at him once. Not a glance. Not a flicker. Her silence was more punishing than 1,000 sharp comebacks. She wasn't just in 2D anymore. She owned 2D. And Harrison, for the first time in years, looked like a man who didn't belong. The cabin settled into an uneasy quiet, but it wasn't peace. It was the kind of silence that comes after lightning strikes, when everyone waits for the thunder. The captain had returned to the cockpit, but the weight of his verdict lingered. Passengers sipped their champagne slower. Conversations dropped into whispers, and eyes darted nervously toward Zendaya as if she might do something else extraordinary. But she didn't. She stayed calm. She stayed focused. That was the point, because power doesn't always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it sits still, making the world tilt around it. And as the engines roared louder and the plane lifted into the clouds, no one in that cabin realized the storm wasn't over. Harrison's humiliation was only the beginning. The true reckoning was waiting for him when the wheels touched down in San Francisco. But here's the question. When power like this is revealed, does it end the fight, or does it make enemies more dangerous? The landing gear screeched against the tarmac, but the real crash was waiting inside the terminal. The first-class cabin had gone silent as the seatbelt sign chimed off. Passengers stood, stretching, collecting their bags, but there was no casual relief in the air. Everyone knew something was about to happen. Zendaya sat calmly, adjusting her notes for the STEM challenge. She didn't rush. She didn't even glance back at Harrison Vance. For her, the battle had ended hours ago, high above the clouds. But for Harrison, the storm was just beginning. He tried to move quickly, fumbling with his designer briefcase, pushing past others in the aisle. His jaw was clenched so tight the veins in his neck bulged. To him, getting off first wasn't about catching a ride or making a meeting. It was about escaping, about finding a way to spin the story before it reached the wrong ears. But the wrong ears had already heard. As the jet bridge door opened, two men in dark suits stepped inside. They didn't wear pilot caps or security badges. They wore the heavy stillness of corporate power. Passengers froze mid-step as the men locked eyes on Harrison. "Mr. Vance," one said flatly, voice carrying the kind of authority that doesn't need volume. "You'll come with us." The color drained from Harrison's face. He tried to laugh, to shrug it off. "There must be some mistake. I have an urgent meeting to attend." He waved his phone as if that could erase reality. But the men didn't flinch. The second one spoke colder. "Orajet's partnership with your firm is suspended effective immediately. Pending investigation, your access to all corporate privileges has been revoked." Whispers exploded behind them. Passengers gasped. Some craned their necks for a better look. This wasn't just a seating dispute anymore. This was corporate execution. Harrison's hands trembled. Suspended? You can't just. But they could, and they did. His words bounced uselessly against the silence. One of the officials gestured toward the terminal. "This way, sir." The walk of shame Harrison had endured on the plane was nothing compared to this. Here, in the open space of the airport gate, there was no hiding. Strangers stared. Phones tilted, recording. His world, built on image, status, intimidation, was crumbling in real time. He tried one last move, leaning close to the taller official. "You don't understand who I am." The man's reply was surgical. "No, Mr. Vance. You don't understand who she is." And with that, Harrison was escorted away, his protests fading down the jet bridge. Zendaya, stepping off moments later, watched without a word. She didn't need to speak. The message had been delivered for her. Power had shifted, and Harrison Vance was now nothing more than a cautionary tale. When a white executive loses everything in seconds while a black teenager rises untouched, is that justice or just another kind of power play? Tell me in the comments. Was Harrison punished for racism or for daring to cross the wrong empire? And just as Zendaya blended into the crowd of travelers, a figure was waiting near the exit. Someone who knew her face, her secret, and her bloodline. That figure was her mother. The ballroom of the San Francisco Convention Center glowed with white light, banners of the National STEM Challenge hanging from the ceiling like proud declarations of the future. Teenagers rushed with laptops, posters, and models. But at the edge of the bustle, Zendaya Carter walked with a different kind of weight. She wasn't just carrying her invention. She was carrying the memory of what had happened on Flight 762. And then there she was, Jasmine Carter, waiting by the glass doors. No flashing jewelry, no entourage, no power suit, just a simple dress, tailored and elegant, the kind that whispered wealth without needing to scream it. For a woman who owned an empire, she looked almost invisible in the crowd. But the moment Zendaya spotted her, the fortress of composure cracked. She rushed forward, and Jasmine opened her arms. The embrace was brief but fierce. A mother and daughter, bound not just by blood, but by the fire of what they had both endured in different ways. Jasmine pulled back first, her voice low. "You handled yourself exactly as I raised you, too." Zendaya's eyes searched her mother's. "Why do you hide it? Why do they think someone else runs the company?" Jasmine's gaze lingered, steady calm. "Because power wears a different mask when it comes to my skin. They would never have let me build this if I had shouted my name from the rooftops. Anonymity is my shield. It keeps the vultures guessing." She paused, her hand resting on Zendaya's shoulder. "I built the fortress so you would never have to. But you were born to fight in the open." The words carried the weight of generations. Zendaya stood straighter, hearing in her mother's voice both protection and challenge. And then, like a shadow at the edge of the light, Harrison Vance appeared in the lobby. His suit wrinkled, his face pale. The swagger was gone, replaced by the hollow eyes of a man who had just watched his empire crumble in real time. He froze when he saw them. The girl he had tried to humiliate and the woman he now knew had the power to end his career with a single phone call. Zendaya didn't need to speak to him. Neither did Jasmine. Their quiet closeness was enough. For Harrison, the truth landed harder than any courtroom verdict. The seat he tried to steal belonged to the daughter of the woman who owned the sky itself. Mother and daughter, standing together, unshaken. This wasn't just a reunion. It was a coronation. The heir to an empire had taken her place, not with arrogance, but with dignity. And while this battle was over, the echoes of it would follow every passenger, every executive, every person who had witnessed what happens when hidden power steps into the light. When the dust settled, the fallout was swift and merciless. Harrison Vance, once untouchable in boardrooms, was fired before his plane ticket home could even be reimbursed. His company issued a sterile statement filled with the usual corporate words: discretion, operational necessity, experience. But behind the polite language was a simple truth. His arrogance had cost them millions. The flight attendant who sided with him didn't escape either. She was quietly dismissed, her name scrubbed from Orajet's roster, her uniform collected like it had never been worn. To the airline, she was just another random face who had broken protocol. To Zendaya, she was a reminder of what prejudice looks like in uniform. And then came the moment that mattered most. Zendaya walked onto the STEM Challenge stage in San Francisco, her invention gleaming under the lights. No one in that auditorium knew the turbulence she had survived at 30,000 feet. They only saw a young black girl with the mind of a visionary, presenting a breakthrough in clean energy that could change the world. When the judges announced the results, her name was called. A full ride to MIT. A future unlocked. She didn't win because her mother owned an airline. She won because she was brilliant, disciplined, and unshaken. But here's the part no one wants to say out loud. Zendaya had a shield that most of us don't. A mother with hidden power. A silent empire ready to move at her defense. Without that fortress, would she have made it to San Francisco at all? Or would she have been dragged off that plane in handcuffs? Her invention lost. Her future rewritten by a single biased decision? That's the unspoken rule of America's elite spaces. Justice often bends for the powerful, while the powerless are left to fend for themselves. So here's the question for you. Was this a victory for justice? Or just another reminder that sometimes it takes hidden wealth to expose hidden prejudice? And if Zendaya hadn't been Jasmine Carter's daughter, would anyone have cared at all? Injustice like this doesn't just happen in stories. It happens in real life, every single day, when no one is paying attention. Don't let these moments slip by unseen. Subscribe now, so you're never left in the dark. And if this story shook you, inspired you, or made you think twice about the world we live in, hit that like button. Every click tells us you want more stories that expose truth and hold power accountable.